Reform UK, the party which has succeeded UKIP and the Brexit Party, achieved its best ever election results in Wellingborough and Kingswood, coming third in both. The impact of Reform was most clearly seen in Kingswood, where if all their votes had gone to the Tories, Labour would have lost.
So where does that leave the parties as we head towards the general election? Reform's hatred for the Tories runs deep, and they appear intensely relaxed about the possibility of Sir Keir Starmer in number 10. The big question is just how worried should the Conservatives be? Well, still with us in the studio is Chief Political Correspondent for The Times, Aubrey Alloegretti, and down the line, delighted to be joined by the legend that is Professor of Politics and polling guru, Sir John Curtice. Sir John, welcome to Talk TV. Obviously, we know what happens in by-elections. You know, the losing party says, oh, it's a big fat nothing, it's just a blip, it's mid-term and so on. And then the winning party tends to attempt to be quite modest and say, you know, yes, but we've still got our work to do. What should we and what shouldn't we be reading into these results?
Well, the way to read by-elections is to compare by-elections with by-elections. But unfortunately for the government, that is not a very favourable comparison. So as you've already been talking about, I think there's a little bit of disagreement about the numbers, but essentially you certainly have to go back to at least 1992 to 1997 to find a parliament in which the incumbent government lost so many by-elections as opposed to the occasional by-election, and where it has done so on the basis of swings that have been so high of the kind that we've seen in the last 12 months or so, particularly to Labour. And of course, we know what happened in the 1997 general election. Now, history is not bound to repeat itself, but what we were already saying last autumn, and is now continues to be the case, is that the task facing Rishi Sunak is to turn things around in a way that, in the end, eluded John Major back in 1997.
Well, the Conservatives are on a sticky wicket anyway. How much of a threat are Reform to them being able to get any traction at all? Are they going to be a constant thorn in the Conservative Party side, or do you think this will dissipate when we sort of switch into general election mode?
Well, I think all we can say so far is that they have become an increased thorn in the Conservative side, particularly in the last 2 or 3 months, ironically, just around the time when the Conservatives decided to focus on immigration. If you look at the opinion polls and you take the average of them, what you discover is that for every one person who has switched from Conservative to Labour, and they do exist, although some Tory MPs claim not to be able to identify them in canvassing, there is another one who has gone from Conservative to Reform. And that is something that's changed since the original Liz Truss fiscal event that caused the Conservatives so much damage. At that stage, the principal flow was undoubtedly from Conservative to Labour. Now it's a joint flow. And I think what this basically means for Conservatives is not that Reform are threatened to take Conservative seats themselves, that's highly unlikely, but that rather in taking votes off the Conservatives, as you're implying, there is a risk that they will hand more seats to Labour. And Richard Tice, at least, is adamant that, unlike what Nigel Farage did in 2019, he's adamant that Reform should indeed stand. Now, true, it may well be that when we get to the general election, that the Reform vote gets squeezed to some degree. But just remember, even if their vote gets halved, as compared with the 10% they currently have, but if they do stand in Conservative-held seats, that's potentially 5, 6, 7% of the voting seats when there was 0 5 years ago. And that therefore means that any Reform intervention is potentially putting at risk a number of Conservative MPs.
Sir John Curtice, stay with us for a minute. Obviously, one of the Reform candidates, the one who did particularly well, actually, last night, was Ben Habib. He is deputy leader of the Reform Party. Let's just have a listen to what he said after the result.
3 months ago, we polled 5% in Tamworth and slightly less than that in mid-Bedfordshire. And everyone was criticising Reform for not really living up to its polling expectations. Well, yesterday, my colleague Rupert Lowe met our national polling figures in Kingswood, and I beat them by 30% in Wellingborough. So Reform UK has gone from 5% to 13% in 3 months. That's a massive step forward. Electorally, we're going to keep growing. We're going to build on this base. Remember, we're only 3 years old, you know, and I think by the time the general election comes, we're going to be firmly embedded in the electorate psyche as a genuine alternative party for which to vote.
Well, listening to that was Aubrey Alloegretti, Chief Political Correspondent at the Sunday Times. Aubrey, what sort of voters are Reform attracting and how dangerous are they? We heard what Sir John said about the number of seats they might be able to affect, but who are they appealing to?
It mostly seems as though Reform is being successful at mopping up sort of disaffected Conservative voters. There is a sort of suggestion that Labour is also under some threat here, that there was a phenomenon that happened that UKIP saw in 2014 onwards, where traditionally it was Conservative voters that were sort of defecting to UKIP. Remember, there were 2 Conservative MPs that did that. And soon afterwards, there was this sort of social Conservatives who were actually Labour supporters that then ended up changing sides and supporting UKIP and later the Brexit Party instead. This time it seems as though it's still the Conservative Party that faces the biggest threat. Speaking to Labour people today, they don't really feel too much at threat from Reform. They say people who were sort of Labour voters and switched to UKIP in 2014, they didn't come back to Labour, i.e. they're not sort of our voters now, and they weren't in the 2019 election either. I think the difficulty Reform has got is that in 2019, the Brexit Party, it did what it said on the tin. Everyone knew what it stood for. In this election, what is the Reform Party? Sometimes...
that's the thing. Are they a protest party rather than
Sometimes.
anything that people are voting for specifically?
Sometimes ambiguity helps, so being the Reform Party could mean almost anything to anyone. So I can understand that logic, and they are, to a certain extent, a protest vote in the same way that sometimes the Liberal Democrats were. And that's why they've potentially come third in these seats today. The question is really if this is their sort of high watermark, whether or not they can really do much better than this. Both of these seats seemed quite well suited to Reform. And when they come to a general election, they're going to have to probably be very targeted if they want to spend money and energy on certain campaigns.
OK, we're going to talk to Chris Bryant in just a moment. But before we do, the Labour MP, before we do, let's go back to Sir John Curtice. Many people have just been looking at the polls for the last few months, John Curtice, saying, well, Labour's got it in the bag. You know, their lead is so big, and the Conservatives haven't had a lead in the polls in sort of, it feels like in living memory, but certainly in a considerably long time. On the other hand, John Curtice, people say, well, that lead doesn't necessarily tell the full picture. That lead might be quite soft. In other words, when you're stopped by a pollster and said, will you vote, you know, how will you vote? You'll sort of say, I won't vote Conservative, so I'll probably vote Labour. But it might not be, I'll definitely vote Labour. So what would your advice be to the Labour Party off the back of these by-elections, given where the polls are?
Well, I think what the Labour Party has to begin to worry about is not just simply the pathway to winning the next election, but how it maintains its popularity thereafter. Now, I think the honest truth is, you know, you can see in these by-elections that, you know, the fall in the Conservative vote is twice as big as the rise in the Labour vote. Now, the fall in the Conservative vote is substantial, so we shouldn't come away thinking there aren't any people who have switched to Labour who aren't enthusiastic about it. But it's clear that enthusiasm about Labour is not as big as the despondency and despair about the Conservatives. And that therefore, insofar as Labour are potentially going to win this general election, primarily as a result of discontent with the Conservatives, the problem that potentially faces them with is that after the election, when they will also be having to deal with fiscal constraint, an economy that's going anywhere, an NHS with over strong waiting lists, and having to make unpopular decisions, they may well find that they are in as difficult a situation as the Conservatives are at present. So I think Labour, in a sense, do now need to try and seal the deal with the electorate to convey an idea of what Labour is about that people are willing to buy into, and that they're willing to perhaps be willing to sustain through tough times as well as good. Otherwise, I think Labour could find, yes, they've managed to hang on to the Ming vase and they've won the election, but has it been worth it?